So a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. Good to see so many people present. One more time, you can please introduce yourself in the chat box, you and your organization, so we know who's present. I'm really pleased that we're talking today about the important topic of impact measurement for trustees. My name is Erwin Heiltjes. I'm an economist here at MPC in the data and learning team, and I work on impact measurement with a variety of charities on a day-to-day basis, and I will be chairing today's session. I'm pleased to be joined by two fantastic speakers who will share their own perspectives on the subject. We will hear from each of them, and then we'll have some time at the end to answer your questions and hopefully have some fruitful discussions on this topic. Before we get started, some housekeeping. This is a free public webinar open to all, and there may be journalists present. We will be recording the session, including any questions you ask, and it will be available to watch online by others and yourself after the event. If you're going to tweet about it, we encourage you to use the hashtag NPC trusteeship so that others can join the conversation. Please do ask your questions throughout the session using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Alternatively, you can also put it in the chat. We will be collating these and asking as many questions as possible in the second half of the session after the panelists have shared their initial thoughts. We are really, really grateful of the Clothworkers Company for making this possible and to create this event for free for all participants. The Clothworkers have been supporting these trusteeship seminars for many years, and without their support, it would not be possible. So thank you very, very much for making this possible. Now, just before we start, we wanted to be interactive with you joining in with questions. And I just want to see who's in the room. There should be a button on Zoom which allows you to raise your hand. It says raise your hand. And I want to ask everyone to raise their hand who is a trustee at a charity. You please raise your hand. Yeah, there's 20 people already. Excellent, 21. Okay, thank you. You can lower your hand. And then second question, who is specifically responsible for impact measurement within their board of trustees? If you have something like that. 3, only 4. And one of our speakers today also raised his hand, Professor Jim Clifford. Excellent. Okay, thank you. Well, it's going to be a very interesting seminar today, and I hope we'll learn a lot about impact measurement. To introduce the topic, today's topic is impact measurement for trustees. MPC has been rallying for the importance of impact measurement since its foundation 20 years ago. We offer webinars for like these for trustees, but also leading impact series for charity employees. We address all kinds of topics related to impact and impact measurement. We also offer tons of free resources on our website, including a step-by-step walkthrough for charities who are just starting on their impact measurement journey. So if that's something that maybe relates to your organization, do have a look on our website. We also have a team of 30+ consultants who support charities of all sizes and maturities, but also social enterprises, funders, and philanthropists to maximize their impact. We're a charity ourselves, a nonprofit, so our sole goal is really trying to improve the impact of the sector. Now, impact measurement addresses questions at the core of every charity. We want to do good, leave the world a better place, but do we actually do that? Did we make an activity? Did we make a difference with our activities? And if we did make a difference, how did we do that? And can we further improve on maximizing our impact? These are some of the tricky questions that we want to answer, and it's hard to collect reliable data on things that have changed over time. So it's not an easy task. And even if you can collect data on these questions, how do you know the change was down to you? Wouldn't the change have happened anyway? So it's important that we measure impact well and try to do our best to find out the answers to this question. And measuring means using data and evidence, both quantitative and qualitative, to gain useful insights about our activities as a charity. It's about understanding whether the project, the activities, the service has really made the difference in people's lives. Now, given that impact is so central about what charities do, you might assume that it would be central to what trustees do. However, as trustees have many, many different roles, understanding and improving impact is not always top of mind, while it is so important to a charity's mission. Some charities have a specific a trustee tasked with impact measurement, but as we just saw, not necessarily always the case or not necessarily always present here. So what should trustees be doing to make sure that they understand impact, but also that they know how to improve impact and aid and support the charity in that? At today's event, we'll hear reflections from Professor Jim Clifford on how you can take a helpful role as a trustee, and we'll hear from Amina Ali, one of MPC's leading experts on how to use data to influence at your charity. Now, starting with our first guest, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Professor Jim Clifford. He is a longstanding friend of MPC. Thank you, Professor Clifford, for joining this seminar. He is CEO and founder of Sonnet Impact, the impact-focused consultancy, previously at Bait Wells, and now an independent social enterprise, part owned by Sheffield Hallam University, where he is also an honorary professor. His specialisms include impact measurement, design, and governance, which he also teaches at the charity MSc program at City University. He has 40 years of experience with small and large charities and is a trustee at the moment of 4 different charities. The Children's Society, where he specializes in impact and social investments. The Go Forward Youth, a small charity supporting former care leavers in North London. The Bates Wells Foundation, where he co-founded the Stephen Lloyd Award. And the Bach Choir, where he leads in tackling the EDI, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion agenda, making real change. It's a great honor to have Professor Jim Clifford here today, and he will talk on trustees and impact, making sure we help. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Erwin. Okay, if I can move on to my next slide after that full introduction from Erwin, thank you very much. Just a little reminder there down the left-hand side of the page, the particular aspects of my life which I'm drawing upon in talking to you today. The Children's Society trusteeship, where we've been particularly focusing on impact over several years and building our understanding of it and how we tackle it. Go Forward, which is in many ways on the other end of the scale, brand new charity, only founded in 2016. I was one of the original trustees. And then just a note at the bottom about my professional work, which also is informing what I'm saying here. And I'd like to highlight 5 points to you. For those that like to see it written down, I've put them on the screen there. And these are things, if I was going to encapsulate the guidance I would give to any board, which has certainly come about from our collective learning at the Children's Society and Go Forward, it would be these 5 points. So first of all, language and fluency. There are many aspects of this that are new language to us. Impact is a word in general speech, but it has particular meanings in this context, as perhaps Amina will pick up on with us. There are others, though, that outcome, output, approaches, as well as activities. These all have particular meanings, and we can get tangled with terminology if we're not too careful. But more to the point, it's not just that there are some new words, and in order to have meaningful conversations with our fellow board members, we need to have some common understanding as to what we're talking about. But it's also the way of speaking that we want to get comfortable with the idea that we're focusing on what we're achieving and how we're doing it and how much difference that makes to people in their lives, and not solely our natural way of resorting back to talking about the finances, talking about the risk and the safeguarding, important though those are. So the language here, learn it, but also get fluent with it. At the Children's Society, when we were getting the hang of this, we developed, those of us who were on the impact side of things, developed for the trustees and the executive as a group, a training module that enabled them to learn some of the language and a bit of the science behind this, then look at how it's applied through our practice in the Children's Society, working with 10 to 18-year-olds, some at huge risk, some at only moderate risk, and then to be able to practice it in little groups. Let's have a conversation debating which of these two projects we would approve, but focusing on the impact. Let's just practice talking about it. So, language and fluency, very important, and practice it together. Second one is to get confident in impact as a science. We want to be confident when we're having those conversations in board meetings. So we need not just to understand what impact is about and how it comes about, but we also need to get confident in the quality and meaning of the data and the information that we're being provided with. How do we know that a change is happening? How do we plan for it? And how do we explain why it's likely to happen, why we're confident? How can we spot the outcomes happening, the changes happening in people's lives, and be confident that they really have? And how can we measure well enough for what we need? Let's get confident so that we can have those conversations meaningfully. So that really brings us on to data and information. Data, I understand as being the raw material, the bits of numbers and facts and what have you. Information to me is when it's strung together in something that means something, that conveys purpose and a deeper understanding. But all of this data, our information, needs to be based around a story of what's going on, a story of people's situations, of the young people for both of these charities, and how their lives are currently, and then how what we do affects them. Actually, that intricacy of the human condition and how it is affected by support from others, and how the young people need to react for it to be most effective. We hear about it's too complex. We can't get our head around measuring impact. It's all too complicated. I take the view the measurement is not complicated. It is the stories of people's lives that are complex. And we're really comfortable with the complexity of the human condition. After all, we've all grown up with it. So get the core story, give that as the scaffolding for the data and information, and Amina will talk a little bit more about this and the metrics in a minute, but be clear what would happen if we didn't get involved, the counterfactual, and then make sure that the metrics we're looking for from this are relevant. They're relevant for the purpose for which we need the measurement. They're relevant for this as an audience. And we think about materiality. Does it matter to know that? Scrutiny. It's a word that is probably heard more often in the public sector and local authority and some of those sort of settings than it is in charities. But it's a really important one, and it's an important part of our governance function as a board and as individuals. Information that should come through to us at board meeting and what's going on within the charity, we should be scrutinising it in the sense of looking at it, but then peering at it, looking at it more closely, having a bit of a nose around it. So we should be challenging the information that we're given supportively, helpfully, and purposefully. We ought to be questioning what do we know here? How do we know it? And how does the executive interpret this? Because often the executive or the management team are more expert in these topics than a lot of us on the boards. So what do they make of this information? To be able to do that well, we should be allowing time for it in the meetings, bearing in mind I'm talking around impact here, and we should have some sample questions up our sleeves to be able to challenge supportively. Interestingly, on this scrutiny point, the Children's Society resolved as a board that no matter can come to the board unless the impact of the issue is explained. So as I'm putting down a marker point, that's how they tackled it. Sorry about the telephone in the background. That one off. Finally, using it well. It's great getting wonderful people like some of our colleagues here and some of my team and what have you, and the charities to produce all this information, but there is no point having it unless you use it. And there are broadly 4 purposes for which we should be using it. Key and starter one here is to make decisions in the board meeting, to transact, to decide how to apply resources. We're not going to use it for that. There's no point having it. Second one is to monitor and performance manage what's going on. Third one is to be able to explain what we're doing and why to service users, to partners in delivery, to the staff. And the fourth one is to be able to report and engage with the public. I'm not talking about reporting for compliance purposes, which is a bit of a dead-end exercise, but I'm talking about reporting so that we can tell, we can explain, we can exemplify. That was a quick run through of those 5 points. So I'm saying, get your language right and get fluent with it. Get confident in that data that's coming through and that you're going to rely on it and why. Get the right data and information coming through and understand what it is, put it around the scaffolding of the story. Get your scrutiny right so you can challenge it meaningfully and helpfully and make sure you're getting the right information. And finally, use it well. Do use it and use it for a really good purpose. Back to you, Erwin.
Thank you very much, Professor Clifford. This was, I think, an excellent summary in only 10 minutes of such a complex topic. So thank you very much. We will now have 5 minutes for a very short discussion, and then we'll move on to Amina Ali. I want to invite everyone to ask their questions in the Q&A, via the Q&A function or in the chat, and then we'll pick up on those now or later on at the end when we have a bigger panel discussion. So one question of clarification, or if you have some tips on that, is regarding the getting confidence in impact as a science. Do you have some tips for starting trustees or maybe trustees board that are not as experienced with impact measurement on how do we get confident in impact as a science, or how do we get confident with impact measurement if we're just starting out? Are there ways to get more confident as a trustee?
I think talking to somebody who understands the topic, which certainly needs to be somebody from your own charity's impact team or CEO or somebody who is confident in it, or an outside consultant or supporter who is helping the charity, but also talk to trustees of other charities that are using it. There's so much to be said from learning from your peers. So talk to them to find out, but then ultimately I think we get confident in things if we understand them and we can see why we should be confident in them. There's a reasoning and logic that gives us comfort. So if we can go in a little bit more detail to understand what is it we're trying to to learn about? What are the important changes we're trying to deliver for people? And just to explore with at least one other person who understands the context and the approach, what would give us confidence that that outcome was really happening? And how confident would we get? So I think it is by going in, seeing some detail and getting confident in that, then coming back out and saying, okay, so anything that comes forward to me feels like that for the confidence. That will also help us scrutinize.
Yes, and there's a nice question from the audience from Asim Mulji on following up on this, on once you have your own confidence in your data and feel more okay about how you're doing your impact measurements, and you also maybe feel the scrutiny, you have the right level of scrutiny. There's a question of how will the outside world look at it, and charities assessing their own impact might not always be trusted as much. So what can a charity do to make sure that outsiders can scrutinize and improve impact measurements? How should we deal with that? A bit of self-criticism or criticism from the outside of us doing our own assessments.
Yes, I think maybe picking up partly on the sort of thread where I was going just now, but also thinking about what constitutes a good piece of research published. And impact measurement relies on many similar disciplines to academic research and to econometric analysis and that sort of thing. If you explain how you've gone about what you're trying to measure, how you've gone about doing it, and can show the data trail building up to your end answer, then somebody can disagree with your method and we can have a good discussion about that. Someone can disagree with whether the outcome is relevant or not. Somebody can look at the individual data sources and say, would something else have been better? But it's very hard to say, oh, you're just picking that out of thin air. You're just imagining that, if there is that logical underpinning. And I think it is important, whilst it can make some of the reporting a bit long, that we do make that underpinning data within the bounds of confidentiality. We make some of that underpinning data and certainly the methodology available. So take some more academic standards in publication. Don't be afraid to publish your workings, essentially. And I think that's important to building confidence.
You would definitely be in favor of full transparency and always publishing results, also if the results are maybe
within the bounds of confidentiality and individual privacy and so on. I would prefer the route of fuller transparency.
Excellent. All right. Our time for the short follow-up questions is up already, but we'll definitely continue this conversation in the second half when we pick up the panel discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Clifford. All right, we'll go to our second speaker of this lunch session. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Amina Ali, principal at MPC, specializing in impact measurement. She has been trained in social research methods at the London School of Economics and has over a decade of experience in researching and advising the third sector. She has helped with a wide variety of funders and charities to maximize their effectiveness and impact, and is one of MPC's leading experts on impact measurements. So I'm very pleased to have her here today. She will talk about how trustees can use data to make day-to-day improvements to their charities and give you a flavor of some of the frameworks that MPC has developed to support charities on their impact journey. Amina, the floor is yours.
Thanks for that introduction, Erwin. So as mentioned, I know from experience of working with many charities and also, to be honest, some years spent myself as a charity trustee, that impact measurement really supports our ability to learn about what works and to really develop and respond. But obviously, alongside these benefits there are a lot of practical challenges, and I've seen that it can be quite a tricky road to walk for some charities. So as Erwin mentioned, I'm aiming to just share some approaches that I think can be helpful. Next slide, please. This bit's just about touching on the essence of impact measurement. So when people think about impact measurement, they usually jump straight to thinking about data collection and evidence. The impact measurement starts with being able to articulate how your service or your intervention is going to have an impact. So in other words, you want to be showing a thought process for why the idea that you have for your service is a sound one. So a well thought out theory of change can be quite a helpful process to support this, because it allows you to articulate how you think you're going to make a difference. So this thing about, is the idea sound? But it also helps you to plan how you might test it. So I think many of you will be familiar with theory of change, but for those of you who aren't, it's often represented as a diagram. So it's a way of mapping out the movement between these sort of activities and inputs you have all the way across to the final goal or impact that you want your service or intervention to have. A lot of people find that the diagram output is really helpful, but I don't really think this is the most essential part. What we often see is that the process itself is really important. By, really thinking deeply, charities are able to identify gaps, to examining what it is they're doing too much of or not enough of. And overall, it really helps to bring some clarity between the board and staff members about what they're doing and helps them to really get on the same page. So in the next bit, the other part of impact measurement is testing your thinking against evidence. There are a couple of different ways that you can do this. So firstly, you look at the existing evidence base. So taking advantage of any kind of existing external evidence that can help to show that there are links between the outcomes that you know your charity is achieving because you measure them, and the longer term impacts that are harder to track without having more extensive resources. So you also want to look at the data that your charity collects about its services and really consider what this tells you about whether you're achieving your desired impact. I'm going to touch on this a little bit more in the rest of my presentation, but overall what I want to leave you with from this slide is that you can consider theory of change and impact measurement as two sides of the same coin. So on the one side, your theory of change is showing your aspirations, and on the other side, impact measurement is what you test. It's your reality, what you can prove about the effects that you're having. Next slide, please. So this slide shows some different types of data that we would really recommend that charities collect in order to understand their impact. But firstly, I'll mention that we typically think of impact as meaning the sustained effect of an activity, whether it's on individuals, communities, or environments, depending on what your charity is doing. But because it's sustained and long term, it's often something that's achieved after interaction with your service ends. So too often, I see organisations be quite hyper-focused on impact data, but I think it's important to think about other types of data that are part of the picture and help you to understand your impact. So here are 4 types of data and the 5th one is impact, which I've left off this slide. But the first 2 types of data, user data and engagement data, are about information you collect from people when they sign up and how you record attendance. So I'd always argue that this is something that you need to collect because it sort of helps you to understand who you're reaching and if they're engaging. If you don't understand if you're reaching people and whether they're engaging with your services, it's much harder to know anything else for certain. Engagement data usually includes activities and outputs, but we tend to sort of call it engagement and focus on engagement because I think this is much more interesting. It enables us to understand if the service is reaching its intended audience. It enables you to explore, are you getting dropouts? Are these amongst certain groups? What might be the causes of those dropouts? I'd also argue that you always need to collect feedback data. Your approach to this can be formal or informal. Formal approaches might be things like questionnaires, focus groups, informal methods might be just encouraging service users to tell you what they think and having a process embedded for examining what the quality of your delivery is. So together, your user data, your engagement data, your feedback data all help you with impact management. They provide you with the early warning signs of issues or areas that might need some course correcting. If your charity is managing well with collecting these first three types of data, outcomes data is the obvious next priority. It tells you about whether people are benefiting from your service. Depending on how you measure it, it tells you about the magnitude of the changes that people are experiencing. It helps you to explore if there are unexpected effects or unintended results that need some digging into. People do often think that, at least people I sort of come across when charities worry about measuring everything or all aspects of their theory of change or all aspects of their service delivery. This isn't always practical in terms of resources, and it's not always necessarily beneficial either. So it's really about being able to prioritize the outcomes that are most important. You want to be able to think about outcomes that you directly influence rather than outcomes that your charity indirectly supports. Consider which of these outcomes are most important to you, most important to your mission, or most kind of material to your strategy. Which of these outcomes aren't too costly to measure? An example of this would be that some methods of data collection might be more resource intensive and more costly for you. It might be that short to medium term outcomes are more manageable, and tracking longer term outcomes, which might involve following up with people after they've left your service, that might be more costly for your charity to implement. And then finally, I'd probably suggest that it's important to consider which outcomes, if you were to collect data about them, are likely to produce credible evidence. So that gets into some technical things sometimes, like how sure can we be about what we're measuring, and things like validity. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see the cycle of good impact practice, and I'll just briefly describe the four steps that you can see here. So we begin by planning how to create the desired impact. So here you'll be developing a theory of change, as I mentioned, and really planning your data collection approach. The doing phase, this is where you carry out your data collection and see how you're progressing towards your goals. Next, you're assessing how things are going. So this is where you'll be analysing and making sense of the data that you've collected. And then finally, in step 4, you review. So this is where you're communicating your results, reviewing what you've learned, and using findings to improve your work. So all these steps are quite critical. It's really a continual journey of learning and improving, not only using your data to learn and improve, but kind of querying how the actual process of planning for impact and collecting data went, and just making those adjustments as needed. This is not an easy thing for charities to get right, and I think trustees in particular can play an important role in getting charities to focus on closing this loop between reviewing the implications of data and evidence and actually using learning to inform planning and strategy development. So developing a good learning culture is part of ensuring the loop is closed. So the loop is that between the sort of review and planning and your strategy development and your planning phases. So I just want to share a few signs of a good learning culture that trustees can look out for or explore with their senior management and leadership teams. So one thing I would query is, are senior leaders communicating how learning can achieve objectives? Do staff understand what their role is in learning? Staff should feel that learning, including failures, it's not something that's feared. There's no sort of blame mentality when things don't go to plan. And this is something that trustees can model in terms of encouraging accountability, but also being and encouraging a positive and open approach to examining failures. So results and learning should be sort of shared transparently. They should be discussed. And importantly, organisations should try to see things from a service user perspective and gain their input wherever possible. And really, I think what Jim has mentioned is really that the story of how service users' lives were and how the charities affected them should be key as this kind of continual thread throughout your 4-step process of planning, doing, assessing and reviewing. Hopefully the above are all things that charities can think about and that trustees can help their organisation to explore and kind of push them towards getting there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Amina, for your very insightful presentation with a lot of ground covered in such a short time. Good, this video will be online for everyone to watch back. Please do still submit your questions in the Q&A. I have just 1 or 2 questions for you, Amina, and then we'll pull Professor Clifford back in for the panel discussion. One of my questions is on the amount of data and the speed at which you sort of dive into this topic as a trustee. In my experience, trustees often want a lot of data when they really get going, and they want to know a lot about what's working, what isn't working. But this comes at a cost to the organization as well. How do you balance that as a trustee to want to have data, want to have insight, want to create a learning culture, but you also don't want to overburden an organization which is struggling perhaps to get the day-to-day organization going?
I think it's particularly common when an organisation is undergoing a challenging time to focus on information. So if we get more data, we get more information, we do more research, then that will kind of give us the answer. And there can be less of an inclination to look at what's already there, what's already known. There's usually the seeds of that information are there, and there needs to be sort of more time spent really exploring it. I mentioned a bit earlier when I was presenting about undergoing prioritization exercises in terms of thinking about different types of outcomes that you might want to collect data on. So I think this is something that can be done as a board, or it can be a personal reflection that a trustee goes through before making a request for data or information. I talked about things like considering how material that data or outcome is to your mission, to your strategy, considering how likely it is to produce credible evidence, really asking themselves all these questions before, sort of adding a request to that pile. I think the most important thing is just sort of seeing what sources of information are already available to them. And that might be internal data, but also, as I touched on, sometimes external evidence can help bridge gaps in what we don't know or what we need to learn more about.
Great, thank you, Amina. Then I want to invite Professor Clifford back on for the panel discussion, and invite all the participants to submit their questions. I'm going to start off with the first question from Kate Wilson. Any tips for funders funding impact measurement or capacity building for charities and trustees? Our struggle, like many, I'm sure, is resourcing and skill. So the question is, any tips for funders funding impact management or capacity building for charities? Maybe Professor Clifford, you want to start?
Yes, sure. I think most funders are interested in the change they can make through their funding. So I would always start, I think it is a very good idea to approach funders for funding for impact measurement, but explain what you're going to do about it and why you need to know it. And so that they can get this sense of if we fund this piece of work, we will learn things around this arena, and then the organisation will be able to reach more people, to reach people more deeply, to get better voice from service users involved in the research or whatever. So explain to them what's going to be achieved by it. But if you do that, you've got to be prepared to deliver on it. So you've got to go through with it.
And the question might also be interpreted the other way around. What if you are a funder and wanting to fund impact measurement capacity building? Any tips from that side as a funder wanting to help the charities or your grantees?
I think something I would add in is, I guess there's a couple of different routes that might be helpful for organisations if funders want to fund this type of work. One is really funding them to build the systems and processes. A lot of organisations struggle because they just don't have, the right kind of like databases and systems and things that enable them to collect and manage data without it being so laborious and sort of manual and time consuming. And then the other thing to think about is how funders can support people to, as I said, kind of build that culture, that impact culture, that learning culture within an organization. So less focused on maybe kind of like funding an individual project or sort of like evidence and data management for that, but more how can we build this throughout the organization. Spreading skills across the organization is quite important rather than it being kind of located within one person or one team. Approaches, although they've been long used and really familiar, but approaches like having kind of impact champions within an organization can help kind of spread that skill and awareness more widely. But also peer learning, so that once that investment has been made, people might then sort of encounter practical challenges. So having something that's funded where they have a peer group, there are places where they can engage with other organizations and be able to kind of talk through those challenges and get that kind of tips and advice from similar organizations. That can be quite a helpful thing to fund and support as well.
Thank you. There's a specific question here from Terry Harrington, which I think is something that more charities are struggling with. Sometimes you have a target group which is a bit more difficult to reach in terms of surveying, for example, because when you start surveying them, they might be impacted or they might be vulnerable. So the question from Terry Harrington is: we provide services to elderly people with cognitive difficulties. How would you approach assessing real impact in such circumstances?
Shall I have a go, Amina, and you can follow on? Because yes, you do encounter this with elderly people with cognitive difficulties. Yes, you also get it in children's intervention and traumatized children and young people, which is another area that we work in. I think it is, Amina touched on the point about essentially triangulation of data, getting information from a number of different sources and seeing what that tells us about the overall picture. I wouldn't be ignoring verbal information or feedback information from people solely because they have cognitive difficulties. I think it's still valuable information. But we can also look at their presenting behaviours, certainly something we do with young children. Look at their presenting behaviours and think, what does that tell us about their feeling, about their well-being, about their responses? Take information from the various professionals working with them, and particularly the carers, the frontline carers, that often know them far better than anyone else will, and don't ignore the possibility of getting information sources from other elderly people with cognitive difficulties in their community. So I think that correlation and comparison of information from a number of sources, you can get a deeply nuanced sense of what is going on.
Beautiful. Thank you. And,
I was going to say, I completely agree. I think that's a great suggestion. And I did a project quite a while back with people with dementia, and that exactly the approach of being able to collect some data from their carers as well in terms of a data source for validating that. It was really helpful to us.
Thank you both. Great suggestions. Picking up on something you said before, Amina, about the cycle of good impact practice. and something that Professor Clifford said about impact measurement supporting decision making. It's about closing that loop and really using that evidence and data to set your strategy, to make decisions. But then there's a question from Graham Randalls, who says, who finds that their charity is committing themselves to measuring outcomes in order to win funding bids without having the time to step back and really think about the impact. So I think this is something we see a lot. We're wanting to close the loop and use our impact assessment to really drive learning and use it for decision making. But in practice, we're sometimes just caught up in evaluations for funders. Is there a way to break this cycle or fix the cycle? Professor?
I think one key element of it, there's an underlying, I think, message that coming through, maybe we're interpreting it from Graham, that the funder is saying what outcomes they want to measure. I'm not sure if that is implied or not in there, but let's suppose that it might be. Come back to the point that I was making, and then Amina was expanding with the detail around. This is all about telling stories. It's about telling the story of the situation people are in before we come to support and help them, and then it's the story of how our intervention has worked and what's made it work and how it has changed their lives. That is, whatever way you tackle it, that's deeply interesting to most funders because it's right at the heart of what our money is doing. So notwithstanding you're on this treadmill of trying to get outcome measurement out there, just stop, even for half a day or a couple of hours, and do some storytelling around some typical, we have two typical people we help. Let's just tell their stories for a couple of hours. And then look in at those stories from the perspective of different stakeholders, including the funders. And what are the bits that would stand out for you as really, really deeply important? And that's an exercise the Children's Society has been doing recently with the hugely complex and all sorts of different schemes and support programs they're running. How on earth do we come out with something that is simple and meaningful? And what is apparent there is that there are basically three sets of delivery outcomes. There are the deep, horrible, you are in such a mess, you are likely to die sort of problems that they help with. There are the medium, large volume, medium need, key outcomes. And then there are the lighter touch, we'll just touch them gently ones. And the metrics that we can choose for those three are relatively simple once we understand that there are those three broad storylines that we can tell. So I think stop, tell some stories, facilitate it if you can, and then look in at those stories to understand what the important measurements are we could be talking to our funders about.
Thank you. Amina, do you want to add anything?
I think that this is really a thing about how, to some degree, about how funders fund, and that's, I think there's a sort of work that the sector is really doing about more flexible funding. So this is less an issue, but obviously we're dealing with the practical reality of the funding contracts that you have at the moment and what they actually look like. I think in terms of putting together bids, an approach to impact evaluation that can be helpful is sort of describing that you're going to do perhaps a more developmental evaluation, if that suits your intervention. What that means is you're less predetermining upfront all the outcomes, all the questions, exactly what you're going to be doing, and more responding to the delivery and to the intervention, and having more of a kind of collect and review continuous cycle. And that means that the kind of learning and review is embedded within the delivery, and the funder understands that your outcomes might shift a little depending on what you're learning and what the data is showing you as you go with your delivery.
Wonderful. Thank you. Unfortunately, the time is almost up already. So I think we've had some really insightful discussions on impact management for trustees, and we've had a lot of view on what are different options. But it might also sometimes be a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're just starting on this. The amount of influence you can have as a trustees, the different options there are in terms of measurement, and then the richness and complexity of real life and the stories we're trying to tell, which you touched upon, Professor Clifford. So my final question for both of you would be on the next step, the one thing to change as of tomorrow for all the trustees that are listening in today. What would be like a first thing you can change tomorrow, a habit, a practice, or relating to impact measurement, which can really start to get you going on the impact measurement journey as a trustee?
Mina, I pitched in first last time. You went up
I think this is more an attitudinal thing, but I think what trustees can do immediately in terms of what they model as a board is really that they value and that they focus on improving rather than just proving. I think charities can be really caught up in both proving to funders and proving to their board their effectiveness. But if the trustees show that they care about the improving piece and they model that, that's a sort of first kind of cultural win, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, I totally agree. I can hear in my head someone recently saying, we want to measure to improve, not measure to prove. Great, you've got the right idea. I totally agree with Amina. The other one I think I would do as a first step is going back to my first bullet on the slide, which was language and fluency. Can we start practicing to have those conversations and not just pulling back into discussing the finance or the risk all the time, which are our safe havens? So go and try and have a conversation with a couple of your fellow trustees about the changes that are being made. Don't even have to call them outcomes or impact. Just talk about the changes that are being made and how they're coming about. That would get you going in the right direction.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. Thank you, Amina Ali. Thank you, Professor Clifford, for your contributions today. I think we could have talked another hour on this, and I think we'll have to plan a follow-up at some point. I also really want to thank all the participants for all their questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of them. And I really want to thank Clothworkers Company for funding this series of webinars. As said, this recording will go online for everyone to look back at. And last but not least, as you all are working on charities, in charities, it's important to collect data and feedback data. So we would love for everyone to please fill in the feedback survey of this webinar if possible. It will only take a few minutes of your time, and it will ensure us to not just measure to prove, but really measure to improve. So we would really like to ask you to do that for us. Thank you for taking the time for that. And if anyone has a few more minutes to spare, we also usually like to do a little follow-up interview with one or two participants to hear a bit more rich stories about how they experienced the session. So if you're open to just giving a little bit more rich feedback, please let us know in the chat, and then we will follow up on you with a very short telephone interview. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the participants, the Clothworkers Company, and our two speakers of today, Professor Jim Clifford and Amina Ali. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.